Good evening, everybody. I am Lloyd Auerbach, also known as Professor Paranormal, and welcome to Ask Professor Paranormal. So we have a few people in here. Hi, Paul. Good to have you here. So for those of you who have been here before from one of the podcasts, then I don't have to give you this preamble, but for anybody who might be new, this is a place for you to ask questions about parapsychology, the paranormal in general, psychic experience, psychic ability, psychics and mediums, real and phony, all of that fun stuff. And for those who don't know me, I've been in the field of parapsychology for, God, coming up on 47 years. Yeah, I'm that old. And been Yeah, thank you. So I've been around. Basically, I consider my career starting, or at least my involvement when I started a graduate program in parapsychology, a master's program. I started working in the field in 1982, and have been in and around the field working, teaching, mostly teaching since that time, but investigating since 1979. So, although that's kind of petered off these days, try to give a lot more to my students when I get these few and far between cases that come in. So, while I specialize in investigation type work, field work, I do teach stuff generally about parapsychology, including research in the lab. So, kind of cover it all. And I've worked with psychics and mediums for decades too. Anyway, that's by way of intro. I should also mention that I have a background in magic and mentalism and perform professionally, actually, as Professor Paranormal. That's where that title came from. Um, and Incarnate Paranormal, and you hit your 18th year in the paranormal August 1st. That's still a good number of years to be involved in the field for sure. So that's definitely a very, very good number. And I think that, as long as people are serious about the field, even 5 years is good for things. So I can start out by talking a little bit about the upcoming classes we have for the Rhine Research Center until I actually see a question. I actually have a question that somebody emailed me that may or may not kind of fit in tonight. But if you go to the Rhine Education Center, which is just rhineedu.org, and the link is in the chat. It's also on the channel description. You'll see descriptions of the classes that are coming up. And I am teaching a class that may be I know it's of great interest to Paul, and he's taken it, and that is called Human Consciousness and Survival Studies. So it's focused on the evidence we've collected and what we've done in research in the field and elsewhere on the idea of consciousness surviving the death of the body or life after death. And really, we have a wide range of types of evidence that has slightly different weight to it that supports this concept. So in the course, I go through all of that. What's the latest? What's the history of all that? How does it work against other psychic explanations? And certainly, how does it work against other explanations in general? And that's an 8-week class that I'm teaching. All the classes start the first week of May. I'm also teaching a course which combines parapsychology and anthropology. So if you're interested in how other cultures have and do look at psychic experiences and psychic abilities, that's a class that I go into it. Kind of witchcraft and sorcery beliefs as they would be defined in anthropology. I do have an anthropology background as well. And that's always an interesting class to talk about because so much of what we're exposed to, even in pop culture, has nothing to do with other cultures. It's all about Western culture for the most part. And then I'm teaching a 4-week class called A Practical Guide to Psychics and Mediums. Had another title for it years ago, but that's a course that dives into if you are an investigator or a researcher, how do you find a good psychic or medium to work with? If you are a person who wants to get a reading, how do you find a good psychic to work with or medium to work for to see? But more importantly, how do you know that they are a good psychic or medium? How do you know that they're providing useful information? How do you know that you want to work with these folks? And how do you know that they're not a phony? So we talk about psychic fraud also in that. So if you want to learn a little bit about that from the mentalist magician perspective, I'm happy to cover that as well, and I do cover that in that class. There are two other classes that are, one is an introduction to parapsychology. It's a great survey of what the field of parapsychology covers in terms of the spread of psychic abilities, psychic phenomena, research that we've done. And that does include going out in the field and doing investigations to some extent. That's a piece of parapsychology. And then the last class, which is also an 8-week class. So the intro to class is taught by Jimmy Akin, who has a great podcast, by the way, called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Highly recommend it. And the other class, the last class, is called 8 Studies in Parapsychology. So it's really John Kruth, who's our research director, goes into 8 specific studies, which include, by the way, the Seaford poltergeist case, which was the main case that led to our understanding of poltergeist phenomena as from living people, not the dead. And John goes into, of course, Gonsfeld studies and other studies in parapsychology in different directions of what we're looking at, psychokinesis, things like that. So those are kind of cool classes. If you've never explored, these are all live classes, live lectures, but not everybody attends live because we do have the recordings up the next day. So there's plenty of opportunity to interact. So I do recommend, if you're interested in going further, that's where you can go. The other thing I want to say is, if you go to my website, which is just lloydauerbach.com, I just added a link to a lecture I did this past Wednesday, how to choose a psychic or medium, and how to assess a psychic reading. So it's kind of a short form of that class that I mentioned, the Practical Guide to Psychics and Mediums. And I just did that for Ghost Education 101 for their site. And there's a link on my media page. If you just go to lloydauerbach.com, just click on media at the top tab, and you'll see recent podcasts I've done. You have to kind of scroll down, take a look at the lectures, and then the podcasts that are there. So all of that's there. And thank you, Paul. ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists, slowly but surely, I am working on it for a 40th anniversary edition, which will include some new material and just a little bit of revision of the original version as well. So that will be coming hopefully in the next 2 to 3 months, probably towards the summer, because I have some other things I'm working on first. The 40th anniversary technically is not till October. So if it should be out before October, but that may be the time I'm shooting for to release that. And if you are interested in the history of the field, if you're interested in investigating, that's kind of the book that a lot of people cite as getting them started. It's not the book that got me started, but it is the book that apparently other people are citing. So anyway, let's see. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. And thanks for the recommendation for the survival class. Yeah, as well. All right, so anybody have any questions at all that I can kind of address? And if not, I'll talk about something else. So why don't I talk about the question came from my friend Dave Manganelli. Some of you know that I wrote a book called Mind Over Matter, which will be back in print this year from PDN Books, a new publisher. And of course, one of the things that folks always think about when they think about Mind Over Matter is Uri Geller and bending spoons and keys and all sorts of other stuff. And I've actually run spoon bending parties, PK parties as we call them, based on a method from an aerospace engineer named Jack Houck, who used to run them in the 80s. And that's based on actually some good solid psychology of mind over matter, or psychokinesis as well. And they're always fun to do. People do end up bending their spoons and forks and all sorts of other stuff as well. And Geller himself, and Uri Geller, if you really know something about this Israeli psychic, is a really interesting guy. One of the nicest people I've ever met, by the way. Did spend some time with him here and there. And Uri bent stuff, not always psychically, He certainly has, it's pretty clear that he's been doing some more performance type stuff. And actually, he started as an entertainer, and he would always talk about that. I interviewed him back in the 90s at his home when he was living in England for Japanese television. And they had asked me to ask him certain questions. One of the questions I asked Uri was, "Are you a psychic?" And he said, "I'm an entertainer. Everyone has psychic abilities." And that was his message all along. No matter how much the amazing Randy, no longer with us, and other skeptics have attacked Geller over the years, Geller is pretty clear that we all have psychic abilities. And I think really feel while I know he could do some PK here and there, and certainly remote viewing and other things, I think his superpower was motivating people to be psychic, giving them permission to be psychic. And that's an important factor. In fact, he taught a motivational workshop here in San Francisco in the 90s. And I've had, through corporate work I've done, I've sat through motivational speakers. And I got to tell you, Geller's motivational workshop was better than anything I've seen anyone else do, because he truly gave people power. And I don't mean psychic power necessarily. I mean, he really made people feel confident, comfortable in their own skin, willing to try things, even if they failed, all of that. Really just amazing. And I think that came from him having to deal with the skeptics in some respects. Kind of got some lessons there. Paul saying, so you've been dealing with a skeptic, really a pseudo-skeptic is true. They're pseudo-skeptics. And the fact is that the skeptic organizations, which are outgrowths of the original organization today, and this is in many respects, if you go back to the 1960s, certainly in the 70s, about through the mid 70s, and partly when Geller came in, you find that colleges, first of all, I know when I was working at the American Society for Psychical Research in the early 80s, we had a list of over 100 colleges that had at least one parapsychology course. A couple of them were taught by skeptics. Most of them were taught by professors who were interested, who were teaching these classes. And then there was a handful that were also adult ed courses and not for credit, but many of those were electives in colleges. After that, after the skeptics, the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, which formed in the mid 70s, once they got started, they made it their mission to make it uncomfortable in academia and in science that to call parapsychology a pseudoscience, that there was nothing to any of this. And unfortunately, it made it very difficult in academia for people to teach courses or even do courses or even talk to people, even to their colleagues about this subject, which is sad. And it's not as bad today, partly because of the interest in consciousness, but it's been bad. And there are some Marcello Truzzi, who was himself a skeptic, but worked with parapsychology because he was a true skeptic. He would call any of these disbelievers pseudo-skeptics because they're not looking into the actual evidence. In fact, many of them will say, why would I look at it? There's nothing to it because it's impossible, which is not scientific. 11, let's see, had a psychic vision in 2015, wondering if a psychic would be a good way to interpret it. Possibly. Think about psychic visions like dreams. And a good psychic would ask you questions to help you interpret the vision. They might pick up some additional information to add to that, or they might not. So when you do dream interpretation, it's not as simple as picking up a dream dictionary. It should never be that, because those dream dictionaries were written by people who were interpreting symbols personally. And actually, there's a lot of, I don't want to call it plagiarism, but a lot of copying from earlier dream dictionaries and meanings. And Western dream dictionaries would be very different than Eastern dream dictionaries. So you ask yourself, what does this element mean to me? Is this literal? Is this a symbol, a metaphor? And if it's a metaphor, what does it represent? So that asking questions like that is a good way to go through it. And if you look at it, a psychic vision, potentially psychic vision, as a dream, there are psychic dreams, just like a waking psychic vision, and you still ask those questions. What do these things mean? What is literal? What is missing if there's information that's missing? And those are things that a psychic might be able to help you with. I would ask before booking a psychic whether that is something the psychic can help you with. All right. Let's see. Paul used to read Skeptic magazine and the Skeptical Inquirer, mostly popular opinions, or yeah, I see you mean opinions, not scientific. So they still are being published. So Skeptical Inquirer is the publication that started from the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, which is now the Center for Inquiry. And Skeptic magazine is Michael Shermer's magazine. They cover a lot of ground, not just paranormal, unexplained stuff. They're also dealing with more political stuff, more philosophical stuff as well, which is good. I mean, I think that they actually are looking at, like there's a whole thing about vaccines, um, because of what's going on now in the current administration. So, and a lot of health issues, health stuff. But they're also, depending on who the author is, they're typically very critical of there being anything to any of the things we think about. Um, Michael Shermer himself has been a little bit more open to talking about this. There are some of the skeptics who just simply will, and this has been published in the Skeptical Inquirer, things like, as I mentioned, uh, saying that there's not, we did not look at the data, we did not look at the experiments because why would we? And that was something that, this is something that comes up quite often. Back in 2011, there was a psychology journal, mainstream psychology journal, that was going to be publishing a paper based on a study by social psychologist Daryl Bem from Cornell University. It was a precognition study. And before it was even published, so it was announced as here's the upcoming issue, here's what's coming in it. There was an enormous hue and cry from the academic world, mainly the skeptics and pseudo skeptics, saying, attacking the journal for publishing this paper because it's pseudoscience, all of that, because precognition is not possible because of all of that. And there were a lot of reporters actually jumped on there. You can find articles about this. Again, this was 2011. And what's interesting about all of it is there were a couple of reporters who very wisely asked, when they finished their tirade, how this is impossible and it's not appropriate for a mainstream psychology journal and so on. Did you read the article? Have you read the paper? And they would say no. And sometimes say, no, why would I? And that's unscientific, because for all they knew, that paper said that there was nothing to precognition. That paper may have been that that Ben did this entire study. This is not the case. He actually had positive results, but it could have been the case very easily that he did this study and the results were chance. In other words, no evidence for precognition. They did not even consider that that was a possibility. They immediately assumed that this was to support precognition, which it was, but in a very standard way with statistics and all that. The knee-jerk reaction, basically, because as far as they're concerned, this is not possible. And that's, again, unscientific for that matter. Paul, again, Shermer had a paranormal experience at his wedding. He talked about it, Skeptic Magazine. He brushed it off. He also had a kind of a mystical experience when he went through a kind of session with Michael Persinger and his what was called the God helmet. Basically, it was a helmet that mimicked the Earth's magnetic field. He had a mystical experience, and he's been. I talked to him years ago. He certainly is a little bit more open to discussion. He may still not change his mind, but I found him much more approachable than same with Kenny Biddle. He's much more willing to have discussion. But when he's writing for Biddle is writing for the Skeptical Inquirer, writing for his employer, He's got to take a particular position to look at things for that. And he also doesn't, Kenny Biddle, who teaches a class with me, by the way, on a skeptical approach to parapsychology, he's not really well versed in research in the lab. He looks more at the ghost hunting stuff. And frankly, I rely on his analysis of the ghost hunting equipment and coming up with alternative explanations for some things, which makes perfect sense. I rely on that because he takes things apart and puts them back together. And he's come up with a lot of really good support for what we in parapsychology have been saying, which is you can't design a device to detect ghosts right now because we don't know what they're made out of. So all these manufacturers who are selling ghost detectors, they're just making a buck. That's really it. That's really what's going on at that point. And Kenny Biddle stuff is really good for that. I disagree with him on some other stuff, and that's fine. We can have those discussions. And I think it's really important that if you have a discussion with someone who does not believe in or says that they don't think this stuff is real, that these are people who you can actually have a talk with. They don't just simply brush it off. Those are not skeptics. Those are pseudo skeptics. That's an important distinction here. And I'm sure somebody's going to send this over to the skeptic who is watching my show from a couple weeks ago or last month, and there'll be alternative discussion of that as well. All I can say is that if you can have a rational discussion, basically, if they're unwilling to look at the evidence, fine. Then there's no point us having a discussion about this. If they think it's impossible and they're unwilling to look at the evidence or the research because they think the research it's bad methodology, it's like, who told you that? You have to go back to the source. There's no point discussing that. It's kind of like trying to talk to certain people about politics. Let's see. You like Persinger YouTube video called No More Secrets. It's about remote viewing. Okay. Yeah, I've not seen that one or heard of that one in particular. Excuse me. All right. So getting back to the Geller and the question of PK, we do have people in parapsychology. I got to say that the thing about the field of parapsychology is that there are differing opinions. There are people in our field who are doing research to find out what's behind psychic abilities that's not psychic. In other words, they may not know themselves that we can say that there's ESP or not. Most folks in the field do look at the research and they look at the results and they believe there's something to this, but they may not be willing to say, I believe. They may have an opinion instead of belief in that. But when it comes to things like psychokinesis or mind over matter, we have two ways of approaching that. One is looking at effects on computers, consciousness affecting computers and electronics and things like that. And the actual effects are very, very small, and they're happening inside the devices, and they're not things you could see with your naked eye. We call things you can see with your naked eye, like bending metal and such, we call that macro PK. People moving an object, that's macro PK. And there are researchers in our field who are well-versed in other areas who don't necessarily buy into the idea that macro PK even exists specifically. One of those is my good friend and colleague, Ed May, who does not believe that macro PK is a thing. However, over the last few years, we've had conversations. Ed's actually pointed to some things that might explain what we call macro PK that rely on very minimal effort effects in physical reality to kind of set up a domino effect that causes things to move or otherwise. So not a direct effect, let's say, on that vase that moves across the table, but more like an effect that causes things in the general physical reality of that room to cause a shift to make that thing move. There are different physics explanations for this that are possible. So he's open to talking from that perspective. But my friend Dave Manganelli was asking if I knew that Ed May had his keys bent by Uri Geller to a point where they were unusable to get into his apartment or his place. And that sounds familiar, um, but I have to say that if that did happen, if Ed did tell me about that, I just want to say that I know personally some of the best fake metal benders in the business, in the entertainment business. I'm involved in the Psychic Entertainers Association, past president of that. There are mentalists who have specialized or done that kind of thing. And one in particular whose name, if you're familiar with magicians, you might know this person's name. His name's Alen New. He's had some TV stuff on TNT for a while. You can find videos of him on YouTube, I'm sure. He's one of the best metal benders I know. Another one is Guy Bovley. These guys are great. Are incredibly undetectable. In fact, the first time I saw Len do anything, and Marcello Truzzi, who I mentioned earlier, was saying, "You got to watch this guy." He had two spoons in each hand. They were like crossed like an X. He moved his hands like this, and they were both bent. And that was not psychic or paranormal. I'm not telling you exactly how he did that. I'll just say he has really strong fingers. So in his performing, you would never be able to detect what's going on. I'll mention one other thing here about Alen in a moment. Reality here is that it's not unlikely that Geller knows how to fake metal bending as well as do the real thing. And part of that's being an entertainer. If you are putting yourself out, which is how he was discovered, by the way, was at parties doing metal bending and other psychic things. And I've done stuff like that at parties. And if you are genuinely able to bend metal or do some psychokinetic things, the thing to know is that no one can do it 100% of the time. And when you're hired to do that for a party or an event, you better be able to do it because that's why they're paying you. So even if you're fully genuine and you do it, you probably can't do it. I would say even saying 80% of the time is unlikely. So you have to have backup. And that's important. So that's those keys might not have been bent psychokinetically. Probably they weren't. And so and even if they were, Ed's mind would have gone to using basically manipulation to bend them. Now, grab this. So I showed Ed this spoon. All right, so you can see this. This is from one of the PK parties that Jack Houck actually did, and this was handed to me. I found out when we had those parties that I was one of the people who could bend things all the time. And interestingly enough, Jack also handed us things like hacksaw blades, which, by the way, when you bend them, they snapped. At least the older ones did. And I was able to tie one into a knot, literally, very quickly too. So he hands me this, and instead of bending the spoon, I reached up and peeled it over. We actually had a video of that at JFK University years ago until we had a flood in our storeroom, and a lot of our video of lectures and things like that was destroyed. But from an engineering perspective, bending over because of the curvature of the spoon, bending it over, especially if you're holding a very thin spoon like this, the whole spoon would have bent. That's just not possible. Dean Radin has one from a PK party as well. And when I showed that to Ed, Ed just kind of like shook his head, like, yeah, there's not a way to do this easily at all. I showed it to Alen New, and he said, "Was that PK?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "Yeah, you can't really do that." And he had some interesting stories about things happened that he wasn't touching, things moving or bending during some of his shows, and others have as well. So Paul's mentioning here Doug Henning with an H, by the way, not a K. David Copperfield, of course, David Blaine, Chris Angel. There are a number of different, there are many performers out there who are very, very good. For those of you who don't know, who are not old enough to remember Doug Henning, I sincerely suggest, again, it's Henning with an H, you pop his name into YouTube. He was kind of hippie-ish, like a hippie, long hair, always wore t-shirts, bright t-shirts and things. Incredibly good performer, close up and on stage. Dick Cavett did a whole bunch of shows with him. He was on all sorts of talk shows and one of the best close-up magicians ever, I'll say. He also had a Broadway show that ran for quite a while called The Magic Show, and even a later one called Merlin, which didn't last as long on Broadway. Copperfield, I guess Henning was the person everybody knew before David Copperfield came along, in many respects, for that. So I'm going back a little bit here. Paul said, I told the skeptic about the Rhine and the UVA, the University of Virginia, the DOPS group. They said they're familiar with the Rhine and DOPS. You can't get through to them. They might be familiar. They probably didn't look at the research. I'm sure that they don't look at any of the journal stuff, which is unfortunate. All right, Chris Angel, different story. He's big stage stuff. David Blaine these days is more about the stunts that Houdini used to do, not even the magic. I wouldn't even call him that say that he's doing magic so much anymore. Hopefully he's still doing some close-up magic because he's pretty good at that too. And certainly Blaine's show, his first street magic show, made it possible for people to perform magic on the streets, which were not, I can tell you from personal experience, not that easy doing street magic before Blaine's show. These days, I think people are more interested in being surprised than they were then. So, all right, we're about halfway through. Paul, you're the only one who's participating now. Anyone else have anything they want to ask or point me to? Just talk about. I know last time we started getting into ghost movies and things like that, and of course there are TV shows still that, like the TV show Ghost, which is now being franchised all over the world, which is amazing to me. Starting with a British show, which actually kicked off the American show. I think it's really great that is happening because we have ghosts acting like people, even though they're crazy people sometimes. Yeah. In fact, if you've not HBO, I think it's HBO Max. I think I'm trying to remember who has the TV show, the British TV show Ghosts. It's probably Paramount has it then right now. If you're driving, listeners, okay. Yeah, don't worry about it then. The original Ghost show Ghosts from Great Britain had, I think, 5 seasons of 6 episodes. And if you've seen the American version, the ancient being is the Viking that's on the show, whereas on the British show, it's a pre-Homo sapiens caveman named Robin, who is probably the funniest character on the show in some respects. All right, Paul, let's see here. Off topic, you like Mel Brooks? Yeah, Spaceballs 2, the next one, Brooks just released a new teaser. There's a trailer coming next week. But yeah, it's now called Spaceballs 2, the next one. Originally, at the end of Spaceballs, they promoted, watch for Spaceballs 2, the search for more money. And they've renamed it because they have the money. So that's Brooks's stuff is always kind of fun. Big fan. All right. So Ghosts is always an interesting show for going back in time. There's a lot of other stuff that's great. In fact, there's a lot of really good psychic shows. They don't always get it right or exactly the way people experience things. The new one, right? It's the new one, not the next one. Thank you. This afternoon I was at a very small Star Wars, Star Trek convention here in Concord, California, and one of the people speaking on a panel, Star Trek panel on the women of Star Trek, was Nicole DeBoer, who played Ezri Dax in Deep Space Nine. She was also one of the main characters on The Dead Zone, which of course is based on the movie and which was based on the book by Stephen King, and pretty good show about a guy who gets psychic abilities and touches people and picks stuff up. And I think that influenced to some extent Clint Eastwood's movie that he directed called Hereafter, which has a character who's a medium played by Matt Damon. And then there is a woman who survives the tsunami in Sri Lanka, has a near-death experience, and there's a kid who has apparitional experiences. It's actually a very good movie. The thing that's weird in some respects about it, and again, I think this comes from the whole idea of the dead, what the character on the Dead Zone did, is that the medium, Matt Damon, has to touch someone to make the connection with a deceased loved one. And I don't know any mediums who do that. It's a dramatic device for sure. A psychic shouldn't need to touch you unless they're doing what's called psychometry. And psychometry is the ability to psychically pick up information from an object when you touch it. So if they're doing psychometry on the person, if that's what they're doing, then maybe they do need to touch either you or something you own. But we don't see mediums ever having to do that. That would be somewhat of an invasive character trait. But otherwise, Damon's character, the medium, very, very good. And, there's a whole connection. The three of them come together. If you have not seen that film, you definitely should watch it. It's well written. Eastwood's direction is really good. It's not an action film per se, although there's certainly action around the tsunami up front, but it has a lot of good stuff in it. And interestingly enough, at the same time, or approximately the same time that movie came out, there was a movie based on a young adult novel called Charlie St. Cloud, which had Zac Efron in it. And what was personally interesting was that the company that was doing the DVD extras contacted me and then did interviews with me about both movies. So I hadn't seen the movie, either one of them. I had to sign an NDA. I got a copy of the script for each of the movies. And then I would have to talk about parapsychology in relation to what's the content of the movies. And the DVD extras are on, I'm assuming they're on the Blu-ray of Charlie St. Cloud. They're certainly on the DVD of Charlie St. Cloud. The Blu-ray of Hereafter has the extras in it. And one of the other people being interviewed is Alison Dubois, who was a medium, who was the basis for the TV show Medium. In fact, that was the name of her character. She and her husband were the basis of those two characters as well. Although one of the things you have to consider when you watch any scripted show that has to do with anything paranormal, psychic or whatever, is that the writers or the people above the writers are going to change things. They're not going to really have it described the way it actually occurs. So, for example, for Medium, Patricia Arquette's character, Alison Dubois' character, she gets a lot of her stuff. She's working with police, but she gets a lot of it in dreams. That's not how Alison worked. Also, Alison, if you've ever seen any video of her, she's a really interesting person. She's a great medium. She was studying to be a prosecuting attorney. Think about that kind of personality that might do that. So, the very different personality than Patricia Arquette's portrayal. Although the husband, Joe, is pretty much the same. Real nice guy. Alison didn't need to go into a dream state to get connection or get psychic information. It's pretty rare. There are some people who do that, but for the most part, they're doing it while wide awake. In that, things get changed when they show up on TV, and it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate on the one hand, but if you're trying to tell a good story, it may not be that the way psychic abilities work for most people, most psychics and mediums, is interesting enough to portray that accurately on TV. You have to go with entertainment. That's really important. And keep that in mind for any of the reality shows, because those are not reality. While they may not be scripted, there is a crew that is shooting all this. There is a director or producer on set in the area, in the haunted place. If it's a paranormal show, in the house that the Real Housewives are meeting, all of that. And those directors are directing the action to some extent, if not completely. They let things go candidly. I mean, I've done a few reality shows, but I've done other shows too, segments for shows and segments for magazine shows and for different types of things. Shows on the Travel Channel and done Unsolved Mysteries and a bunch of other shows over the years. And inevitably, what will happen is the director or whoever's in charge of that field unit will say, "Hey, okay, so what you just said is perfect, but can you say it shorter? So say it again, but say it shorter. All right, now let's do a longer take. So explain it a little bit more. All right, now do it really, really short. Can you say it a little faster? I mean, they're telling me to repeat what I just said, which came out of my head in different ways. Okay, all right, so walk into this room in this haunted place, and they get me from behind. All right, now they have me walk out, and then they go into the room, and so now come back in and look around and make it look like you're experiencing something. So they're shooting me from the front now. So it's not that it's scripted, but there is a story to tell, and because of the limited time on these shows for a segment for the entire episode, they have to make sure that they're getting exactly the shots they want. Now, sometimes they'll let things like on the paranormal shows, they might let them run, get footage for 30 hours in hopes that something actually happens. And then it goes into the editing stage. And the talent, the ghost hunters, are almost never involved in the editing unless they've been around for a long time. The show's been going for many years, or they're a producer themselves. And those shows are edited to a particular storyline that not only the producers want to show, but often the network, the executives, other people want to show. So you can't count on anything being, it's not a documentary. And even documentaries have biases based on who is making the documentary. There is a bias there. No question about it. It may be a true story. It may be actually very accurate, but going in, here's the story they wanted to tell. I'm telling you all this partly because of not only my experience, but just for those who don't know, uh, my father worked for NBC for most of his career and then had his own company. He was in sports most of that time from about 1964 on. But before that, he was involved in news, and then also even before that, he did some dramatic production as well. My uncle Larry Auerbach. So my father's name was Dick Auerbach. For those of you who know the history of sports production for TV, um, my dad actually was an associate producer on the '64 Olympics. He produced the '72 Olympics. He produced the Rose Bowl game and Tournament Roses Parade for NBC for a while until he left NBC in 1980. And then he had the international rights and broadcast for the game and the parade until he retired in the early 2000s. He had other events that he did as well, including non-sports events. My uncle Larry Auerbach was the director for its entire run of a show called Love of Life, a soap opera. And then he did All My Children for a little while, and he did One Life to Live, I think was the other one that he did after that. In fact, I actually got to be an extra on an episode of All My Children in the '80s. So I grew up around TV, but I also grew up around news. My dad was friends with a lot of news people at NBC, and my uncle Herb Norman was a radio newscaster for WNCA Radio in New York, and a skeptic, by the way. Um, so I've been behind the scenes a lot for stuff that I was watching being produced. Uh, it, it's it's different than what you'd expect. And just keeping in mind that all of this is to get, television, all the paranormal reality shows, all the reality shows are designed or wanting to get ratings, to get viewers, to get eyes on the show. And that will keep the show in production most of the time until someone maybe comes along and says, yeah, we don't like that an executive. We don't like that show anymore. Let's put our money elsewhere, which does happening in streaming. Unfortunately, quite a bit more than we'd like. Some of us get really mad when a show gets pulled after a couple of seasons on Netflix or one of the other streaming services. So there's a lot to all of that. And it is for the scripted shows, I'm sorry to say, but many of the scripted shows actually take greater care at two things than any of the reality shows on the paranormal. One is let's get close to how these things work, which is why I have to say that the dramas and comedies with ghosts in them, portraying the ghosts as real as people, is much closer to reality than any horror film you're going to see. And the other thing is let's make it entertaining. Incarnate Paranormal, seeing what actually happens with the paranormal shows. I can't watch them anymore. I had a hard time watching them for more than a few episodes to even to begin with. And part of it was I did not find them entertaining. In fact, I would get mad because of some things stupid things that they would say. And the assumptions that the equipment was picking up ghosts, which it's not. And other sorts of, and even just simply going in the dark to do the investigations, which was a dumb thing to begin with. Very spooky, especially with Night Shot, but irrelevant when it comes to really to the phenomena. It doesn't make any sense at all. Some of the things that they repeat in some of the shows is folklore that was originally generated by phony mediums in the 1920s and before. There's this bizarre folklore out there that cold spots happen because the ghost needs energy to manifest. Yeah, that number one, cold spots are almost never measured temperature-wise as changes. People feel them because we feel cold. Creepy things could make us feel cold. And the other thing is, that other folklore. So that one piece of ghosts need the heat or the heat energy to manifest. I had somebody send me a really interesting paper that unfortunately has a little bit more math and physics to it than I would think, but with an assumption that poltergeist phenomena, which comes from living people and physical activity, that the energy or force used to move objects was coming from heat, which is why there were cold spots in poltergeist cases. There are not cold spots in poltergeist cases. Those are not reported. So he's making an assumption based on, I guess, equating poltergeist activity with ghostly activity, um, and people often report cold spots when in fact there's not actual temperature change. So it's really, you need to know a little bit more. It's one of the things we cover in the Rhine classes. And just, I'll mention, if you're interested in the whole media way it works with things, have any more interest to that, there's a couple things coming up later this year. I'll be teaching a course called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public in August. It's a 4-week class. If anybody here who's watching this now is someone who goes out and talks to people about the paranormal, one of the things I teach you is how to talk to the average people to make them think that you're not crazy. So, there's a way to talk to people about this stuff without them thinking that you are weird or strange, or we've all had those experiences. I still have them once in a while. But there's a way to talk to people about this that I've learned. Public speaking, writing about this, getting published, all that's covered, but also some background on media in general. And then this fall, I'll be teaching a pop culture class where I'll be talking a lot about TV shows and movies and TV and comic books and all sorts of the paranormal stuff. Paul, yeah, Graveyard Grug, yeah, lights out, definitely for ambiance. Make it look spooky. Sightings in the 90s. There are some sightings TV episodes that are on YouTube. Several people have put them up. There was, and they did actually sightings, the earlier shows, the first few seasons of sightings, I will say, did a much better job than almost any other television production company ever. Because they were the initial producers, the people who were involved initially were much more interested in portraying things as accurate as they could in the 10-minute segment that they could do it. So they still were limited to some extent, but they did a really good job, and they consulted with me and Carrie Gaynor on any of the spooky paranormal stuff, parapsychology stuff. So they did a great job. And then things shifted a little bit. Not that they were necessarily mistakenly presenting things in a bad way, but there were some issues that Carrie and I both had with the production, the new producers or the people who were kind of running the things in relation to how they were treating the follow up with the clients. That's a whole different story that's out there. Um, and my sightings interviews are up on my other YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach. So as long as you spell my name right, youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach, you'll see a bunch of my TV shows or segments that I've done. And there's many from sightings and from some other shows as well that are there. Um, that was the motto of a team I was with years ago. We know you're not crazy. Yeah, it's like the line in Ghostbusters, "We're ready to believe you." That was a line that they had in their TV ad that they put up during the movie. And I think that's a good motto, Um, we take your experience seriously is another way to put that too. Um, Auerbach, thank you. It is pronounced Auerbach, like you set your clocks an hour back in the fall. That's how most of the people in the media, if you were to put the word Auerbach into IMDb, I think you'll see a lot of different Auerbachs, and almost none of them are related to me. There's even, I think, three Larry Auerbachs. There was a Larry Auerbach who recently died, who was a well-known agent in LA, a Hollywood agent. And then my uncle Larry Auerbach, and I think there's another one out there. It's just like, certain it for whatever reason there are plenty of Auerbachs. My brother Ron actually he was retired, but he co-owned a company, sold his stake in the company, but still does editing for them. A company called Geronimo Productions, when they do movie trailers. And so he was doing that for a really long time and they got a lot of awards for many of their trailers. Learned a little bit about the trailer business too, the coming attractions business. And then my brother David works on the Today Show. So we're, still in there. I have a cousin who worked for another company that was connected to television, and a cousin who's a professional photographer. So even though I'm in more of a sort of academic field, I've been involved in the media a lot myself over the years, and it just feels like home for us in the family, you might say. But there are a lot of Auerbachs out there. Just like, I don't know if you're all aware, but there are 4 Christopher or Chris Carters that are there's 3 that are connected to the paranormal. Some of you may know the name Chris Carter, who created the X-Files. All right, that's the name. That's the guy who created the X-Files, Chris Carter. There is a Christopher Carter, friend of mine, colleague in the Psychic Entertainers Association, who is a mentalist. There is a Chris Carter, who's a parapsychologist. And not too long ago, I ran into some advertisements for a mystery writer named Chris Carter, who's not related to any of them. So, there are common names out there, and I find that interesting that there are 3 are connected somewhat to the paranormal right off the bat. Okay, hour back. Okay, right. Thanks, Graveyard Grog. All right, Tina, I'm surprised that Ghostbusters still seems current. It does. I mean, it's really interesting that, obviously it's dated in some of the cars you see and other things, but Ghostbusters still works. I think it does still work, and just the idea worked. But I will mention this in the last few minutes we have. When the movie came out in '84, and for all of you who are younger, back then a movie could stay in the theaters if it was successful for months. And Ghostbusters came out in May of '84. It stayed in the theaters through the fall, through Halloween. That's unheard of these days, possibly because of all the movies that are coming out. But our JFK University Parapsychology program got a lot of publicity. I got a lot of publicity because, for whatever reason, timing wise, I was the only one in town on faculty who got interviewed by the Oakland Tribune. That article came out in September of '84. It got picked up by the Associated Press, ran in hundreds of newspapers, got all these. Our department had hundreds of radio interviews. I mean, I had 250 radio interviews myself between when the article came out in early September at the end of till Halloween, and everybody else in the faculty did them too. All these newspapers, all this stuff that was out there, and it just was an absolute phenomenon that happened at that point because of the popularity of that film. Some of my colleagues in parapsychology were not happy that this movie was making fun of them, especially that first sequence of Bill Murray doing shocking the college student when he got the ESP guard wrong or right for that matter. Um, at a convention of parapsychologists in '85, we had a panel, myself, Charles Tart, and I can't recall who off the top of my head who else was on the panel, talking about popular culture and media and parapsychology. And someone warned me that one of our colleagues, someone who had been one of my instructors in my graduate program, very top-notch researcher, was going to basically call me on the carpet during the Q&A for being involved in publicity for Ghostbusters after the fact. And I was telling Charles Tart about this. And Charlie said to me, leave it to me. This is a true story. So as we get to the Q&A, we had been talking about Ghostbusters, and I explained what the publicity was, and it gave us so much attention to the parapsychology program and all that. Charlie said, I loved Ghostbusters. It was really, really funny. And I just have to say that, one sure sign, if you didn't like it, there's something going on there, because one sure sign of maturity as a human being is the ability to laugh at yourself. And there were people who had their hands up. The person who was going to call me on the carpet, his hand went down. And he actually came up to me and Charlie afterwards and said, I hadn't thought about all the stuff you were saying. And then he looked right at Charlie and said, yeah, I guess that is true, that, can't take ourselves totally seriously. And that's a really important factor here. All right. You Incarnate saw it 10 or 12 times in the theater. I saw Star Wars that many times in the theaters as well, for sure. All right. Star Wars did live in the theaters for more than a year, and it's coming back. The original theatrical version will be out again next, I think, February 2027. I'm kind of looking forward to that. Going to see it there again. Close Encounters also holds up. There are many movies that actually do hold up as seeming current, no question. All right, we're just at the 2-minute mark now. I talked a lot because I wasn't getting a lot of questions here tonight, which is fine. I can always keep talking, or next time if there's nothing, maybe I'll tell a few ghost stories. We'll see what happens. So I'm back in 2 weeks. So keep an eye out on the calendar for that. I gotta actually look at the calendar. I think it's May 5th, I believe. May 3rd. So I'm back on May 3rd. And I hope to see everybody here on May 3rd for the next Ask Professor Paranormal. You can also send along any questions, topics to this email. Some of you have my other email, which is fine also. You can send it to lloydauerbach@gmail.com, but it's askprofparanormal@gmail.com. That's a good way to send me, questions you might want me to hit in the next particular show. I often get questions from one of my colleagues in Scotland who's not awake enough, and I don't blame him given the timing of the show for the UK. But thank you all for coming along, and I hope you all have a great couple of weeks. We'll see you on May 3rd. You'll see me. I won't see you. I don't know. I'll have to try remote viewing. Thanks again. Good night.